The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sprawling gardens of the Hawthorne estate. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses, but for Alexander Hawthorne, the beauty of the evening felt hollow. He stood by the marble fountain, his hands clenched into fists, his heart heavy with a decision he could no longer avoid. Alexander had been reborn, not in the literal sense, but in the way life sometimes gives you a second chance. After a near-fatal accident a year ago, he had woken up with a new perspective. He had realized that life was too short to hold on to things that no longer served you. And now, standing here, he knew it was time to let go of the one thing he had clung to for so long: his engagement to Evelyn Sinclair. Evelyn. The name alone used to make his heart race. She had been his childhood friend, his confidant, his first love. But things had changed. Over the past few months, he had noticed the way her eyes lingered on someone else, his best friend, Daniel. At first, he had tried to ignore it, to convince himself that he was imagining things. But the truth was undeniable. Evelyn had fallen for Daniel, and Alexander could no longer pretend that their engagement was anything but a facade. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs, and turned to face the grand doors of the estate. It was time. Inside, the ballroom was alive with music and laughter. The engagement party was in full swing, a celebration of a love that no longer existed. Alexander scanned the room, his eyes landing on Evelyn. She was radiant, her emerald green gown shimmering under the chandelier light. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight sent a sharp pang through Alexander's chest, but he steeled himself. This was for the best. He made his way through the crowd, nodding politely to the guests who greeted him. When he reached Evelyn, she turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Alexander," she said, her voice soft. "I was wondering where you were." "I needed a moment," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "Evelyn, can we talk? Alone?" Her smile faltered, and she glanced at Daniel, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Of course," she said, taking Alexander's arm as he led her out onto the balcony. The night air was cooler here, the sounds of the party muffled by the closed doors. Evelyn turned to him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What is it, Alexander?" He seemed distant. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "Evelyn, I think we need to be honest with each other. About us." Her brow furrowed and she took a step back. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his voice steady, "that I can't keep pretending that this engagement is what either of us wants. I've seen the way you look at Daniel, and I think you should be with him." Evelyn's eyes widened, and for a moment, she was speechless. Then she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Alexander, I don't know what to say. I never meant to hurt you." "You didn't," he said, though the words felt like a lie. "But I can't keep holding on to something that isn't real. I care about you, Evelyn. I always will. But I want you to be happy, even if that means letting you go." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Alexander, I don't know if I can do this. What will people say? What will our families think?" "Let me worry about that," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll speak to our families. I'll take the blame. All I want is for you to be happy, Evelyn. And if Daniel makes you happy, then that's all that matters." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then, slowly she nodded. "Thank you, Alexander, for understanding, for letting me go." He gave her a small, sad smile. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn. With that, he turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her standing on the balcony, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. The next few days were a blur. Alexander spoke to their families, explaining that the engagement was off. There were tears, arguments, and accusations, but he stood firm. He had made his decision, and he would not be swayed. When everything was finally settled, Alexander packed his bags and booked a flight to Paris. He needed to get away, to start anew. As he stood in the airport, his passport in hand, he felt a strange sense of relief. He was free. Free from the expectations, the obligations, the pain. But as he boarded the plane, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. Had he let go too easily? Or had he simply done what needed to be done? Only time would tell. As the plane took off, Alexander leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had let go of the past, and now the world was his to explore. The streets of Paris were alive with the hum of life, the scent of fresh bread wafting from corner bakeries, and the soft murmur of conversations in French. Alexander Hawthorne walked along the Seine, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. It had been 3 months since he left everything behind. His home, his family, and the life he had known. Paris was supposed to be his fresh start, a place where he could rebuild himself. But even here, in the city of love, the past lingered like a shadow. He had thrown himself into his work, taking on a consulting role for a prestigious French firm. The job kept him busy, but it wasn't enough to fill the void. Nights were the hardest. Alone in his small apartment, he would lie awake, wondering if he had made the right choice. Had he been too quick to let Evelyn go? Or had he simply been afraid to fight for something that was already slipping away? One evening, as he wandered through the cobblestone streets of Montmartre, he stumbled upon a small art gallery tucked away in a quiet corner. The sign outside read L'Éclat de Rêves, the radiance of dreams. Intrigued, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The gallery was warm and inviting, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings that seemed to pulse with life. Alexander moved slowly through the space, his eyes drawn to a particular piece. A painting of a woman standing on a cliff, her hair whipping in the wind, her face turned toward the horizon. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, something that tugged at his heart. "Do you like it?" a voice asked, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was tall and elegant, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, and they seemed to see right through him. "It's captivating," Alexander replied, his voice soft. "There's something about it that feels real." The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile. "It's one of my favorites. I painted it." Alexander raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You're the artist?" She nodded, extending her hand. "Isabelle Moreau. Welcome to my gallery." "Alexander Hawthorne," he said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is mine," Isabelle replied, her eyes lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. "What brings you to Paris, Alexander?" He hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I needed a change," he said finally. "A fresh start." Isabelle studied him, her gaze thoughtful. "Paris has a way of giving people what they need," she said. "Sometimes it's not what they expect." Alexander wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "Would you like to see the rest of the gallery?" Isabelle asked, breaking the tension. "I'd love to," Alexander replied. As they walked through the gallery, Isabel shared the stories behind each painting. Her passion was evident in every word, and Alexander found himself drawn to her energy. She was confident, creative, and unapologetically herself, qualities he admired but hadn't encountered in a long time. When they reached the end of the gallery, Isabel turned to him, a playful smile on her lips. "So, Alexander, do you believe in fate?" He chuckled, caught off guard by the question. "I'm not sure. Why do you ask?" "Because I think fate brought you here tonight," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "And I'd like to get to know you better. Perhaps over dinner?" Alexander hesitated, his mind racing. He hadn't been on a date since Evelyn, and the idea of opening himself up to someone new was both thrilling and terrifying. But there was something about Isabel that made him want to say yes. "Dinner sounds perfect," he said finally. Isabel's smile widened, and she linked her arm through his. "Excellent. I know just the place." They left the gallery and walked through the narrow streets of Montmartre, the city lights casting a warm glow around them. Isabel led him to a small bistro tucked away in a quiet alley. The atmosphere was cozy, the air filled with the scent of garlic and herbs. As they sat down and ordered wine, Alexander felt a sense of ease he hadn't experienced in months. Isabel was easy to talk to, her laughter infectious, her stories captivating. She told him about her travels, her inspirations, and her dreams for the future. In turn, Alexander found himself opening up about his life, his work, and even his past with Evelyn. "It sounds like you've been through a lot," Isabel said, her voice gentle. "But I think you're stronger for it." "I'm not sure about that," Alexander admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." Isabel reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that set us free," she said. "But that doesn't mean they're easy." Her touch sent a jolt through him, and he looked into her eyes, seeing a depth of understanding that surprised him. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. The evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation, and before he knew it, the bistro was closing. Isabel walked him to his apartment, the streets quiet now, the city asleep. "Thank you for tonight," Alexander said as they reached his door. "I haven't felt this alive in a long time." Isabel smiled, her eyes sparkling. "The feeling is mutual," she said. "Good night, Alexander." As she turned to leave, Alexander reached out, gently catching her hand. "Isabel," he said, his voice soft. "Would you like to do this again?" She turned back to him, her smile widening. "I thought you'd never ask." And just like that, Alexander felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe, just maybe, Paris had more in store for him than he had ever imagined.